Hello, friend, and welcome to the Journey Podcast, Church Scars, season number 5, episodes 2. This is your friend Sergio Ochaeta, and today I have a special guest with us here today. His name is Marcos Torres. He is here with us all the way from Australia. Marcos, welcome.
Thank you, bro. Thank you. I just want to say it's really nice to hear a Latino pronounce my name again. I haven't heard my name pronounced by a Latino in a long time, bro.
Is that so? It's usually Marcos.
Yeah, Marcos. I just let it go, man. It's just like just go with Marcos.
Where were you born?
Yeah, so I was born in New Jersey. I'm a Jersey boy, born and raised in Newark, New Jersey. My family's from Puerto Rico. My mother and my father, they're both from the island. But yeah, I've only been to the island once, bro. Other than that, I'm a Jersey boy through and through.
Marcos, thank you, man, for being with us here today. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so, well, you already know I'm a Jersey boy, originally a Jersey boy. Lived there for 18 years, spent the next 5 years in the Army. I was in the U.S. Army, stationed in Hawaii. So that was amazing. Lived in Hawaii, spent a year in Iraq as well. And then I went to Southern Adventist University, which is where we met. So that was awesome, man. And but since graduating there, I've been living in Australia for the last 10 years. In Western Australia specifically, I have a wife who's Aussie and 2 boys who are half Puerto Rican and half Aussie. And that's a crazy mix. Let me just throw that out there, bro. Like we have a lot of headaches.
Congratulations, man.
Oh, dude, it's
when I met you, you didn't have any kids.
Sorry?
When I met you, you didn't have any kids.
I don't think so. No, because you were there first semester, and
yes.
I'm pretty sure we had our first kid when I was in second semester, and then our second when I was in the last semester. Yeah,
gotcha.
Yeah.
So married an Australian lady, have 2 boys, half Hispanic, of course, or half Latinos, and then half Australian. You've been in Australia for how long now? Because I mean,
10 years.
You graduated and then you moved back to Australia right away?
Yeah. So 10 years, man. Been here for a decade.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I love it, man. It's good. It's really good out here, bro.
It's been a dream of mine. I'll tell you something. It's been a dream of mine to preach in Australia. At some point in time, so if they ever they're looking for a preacher,
I'll let them know, bro. Because I know, like the youth department, they'll always be bringing people out. I'll put in a good word, man, for sure.
Dude, I would love it, man. So Marcos, you moved to Australia. Did you started pastoring right away when you moved out there?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, for the first 4 months, I had a little bit of a side job, and I was a Bible worker, but I also had another job. But that was just for about 4 months. The conference picked me up pretty quickly. I started off, I think it was 2014. I was full-time pastor, and I was a full-time pastor until last year when I resigned. I don't like using the word resigned. It's kind of a negative connotation. There were reasons that led to my resignation, but I didn't have like any drama with the conference or anything like that. It's just, I prefer to say I transitioned out of full-time employment. But yeah, so, but pretty much right away, as soon as I got here, I was pastoring. Yep. Okay.
Tell me about your journey as a pastor, your journey, your calling to pastoral ministry. How was that experience, pastoring 10 plus years, and then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but of course, leading to transitioning out of pastoral ministry. How was that experience for you?
Yeah. So, that's a heavy question. There's a lot of layers to it. So let me try and simplify and shorten it. So the pastoral experience, it was good and bad, like anything else in life. There were pros and cons to it. There were a lot of things that I learned and a lot of things that I enjoyed and appreciated about it. And there were things that I found hard and difficult. And I think most things in life are like that. But generally speaking, I would say Australia is a really, really good place for pastoral ministry because a lot of the leadership here is really supportive of creative ideas, innovative ideas. I planted a church under the Western Australian Conference, very, very innovative, very different. So I'll give you an example. In this church plant, we don't have a building. We don't run weekend services. It's a missional network. And that was very, very, very different. And I had nothing but support, not only from my local conference, but from leaders in the union as well. So it's a really good place to work. And I feel like the culture is very relaxed as well. And this has been my experience. I don't know if other people in Australia are like, I hated it, but like for me, it was a good experience. And I say that because I've heard stories of pastors in other parts of the world where that's not the case. And
Mm.
I can only imagine how hard that would be, especially if you're a creative person, how difficult it would be to be in a context where your leadership doesn't support creative ideas, doesn't support innovation. And if you try and do something, you kind of get attacked or you face a lot of resistance. I never had to deal with that. So yeah, so it was a good experience. Local church wise, there were more challenges. So like most of my challenges really were within local church cultures. Particularly because I'm not a fundamentalist. I'm not a conservative in the typical sense in which we think of the word conservative. I value humanity. I value diversity. And I value connecting with people on a very human level. And I found that very difficult in fundamentalist churches. So I had a few churches that were more fundamentalist conservative, and that was always hard. It was like I felt like a square, like you're trying to squeeze a square into a circle. It just, yeah, I always found that really, really difficult. I struggled. There was a lot of anxiety and sometimes even depression going through those seasons, and working with churches like that. But even then, I gave it my best go. I tried to build good relationships. I tried to do good things in the churches, but I always knew the clock was ticking. There was no way I could do that for long, because it just wasn't my scene. So those were probably the more struggles, in terms of like where the difficulties came in, was dealing with cultures of control, cultures that were extremely Eurocentric, lots of rules around ideals that I just found to be existentially vacuous and banal. And just having to kind of, bite my lip and suck it up and try and do something meaningful there. That I think that's where the real big challenges came in. But again, like I said, a lot of things, there's a pro and a con in
Yeah.
everything. And I still did my best to learn from those seasons. And I did learn a lot. Coming into transitioning out of church employment, there were other things that sort of led to that. We can talk about that later. But yeah, that's a little bit of a snippet into what the experience was like. Yeah.
A couple of years ago, the NAD held this event where all of the pastors of the North American division came together, and there was statistics shared at this event where they said a huge, a big amount, a big percentage of pastors, of Adventist pastors, I don't know, maybe it was like 60%. It was something crazy like that. Don't stay in ministry more than 10 years. It's not a surprise that pastors leave ministry for various reasons. For you, when you received the calling to ministry, was that clear by the Lord, going into ministry? And when you decided to leave, was that also clear as well?
Yeah, really good questions, man. It's always been the clearest thing in my life was my calling for ministry. I've never ever doubted that. Um, I think I was about 17 years old when I first felt God calling me into full time ministry. Now, I never knew what that meant, right? Is God calling me into full time youth ministry? Is God calling me into full time music ministry? Because I'm a musician as well. Is God calling me into full time evangelism because I love preaching and I love sharing scripture and explaining scripture, particularly to people who haven't been to church before? Is God calling me into full time pastoral ministry where I actually work in a local church? It was never ever really, really clear which of those he was calling me to, but I knew for sure that he was calling me to full time ministry. And
Mm.
what that meant became clearer over time Because what happened was, by the time I was at Southern, for example, when I came to Southern to study theology, I was basically at this point where I was like, I believe God's called me to be a full-time evangelist and just travel around and speak and preach. And I was really excited, man. I was like, I can't wait to be out there, to be on the road, going to different places around the world and just sharing the gospel. And I held on to that vision for very long. I still remember when I was at Southern, I took a trip with my family one day. We went to, I think it's North Carolina, where the Billy Graham Library is. And you can walk through and see this great evangelist and hear his stories and just see the impact he had in the world. And I remember going there and being like, man, this is like really, really cool. I'd love to be able to do even just a fraction of what Billy did in traveling the world and speaking the good news, right? And then one day, I'm not exaggerating, man. One day I went to bed at night thinking, I can't wait to be an evangelist. This was like my third year of theology. Can't wait to do it. And I woke up the next morning and literally had every desire to be an evangelist just gone. I remember thinking, well, this is weird. It's like all of a sudden I'm like, nah, I don't want to do that at all. Like I have zero interest. And there was no trigger. Like nothing had happened in my life where I was like, oh, never mind. It's not like I went and preached an evangelistic series and did a terrible job and decided I'm not going to do it. Like nothing had happened. It was just a typical school week. I just went to bed one day, excited to be an evangelist, woke up the next day, every sense of excitement for that was gone. And that was kind of scary because I'm like, well, hey, look, I'm in school. I'm studying theology with the goal of becoming an evangelist someday. And now I don't even want to do that anymore. What does this mean? And I struggled with that for a long time. And then on my last year of theology of the program, we actually had to do an evangelistic series as part of our externship. We had to do an evangelistic series and the students went to different locations to run an evangelistic series. And look, the experience really confirmed to me, this is not for me, right? Not that I didn't enjoy preaching. I enjoyed preaching. It was great. Not that I didn't enjoy meeting people. I enjoyed meeting people too. It was great. I think what really confirmed for me was that the way in which we were trained and also the system around which the evangelistic model was based, it really is designed to work for people who are already religious. And to be honest, in many ways, it's designed to attract people who are a little bit emotionally unstable / into conspiracy theories and, doom and gloom, end of the world type stuff. And it's like the system was designed for that. The best way I can describe it is the whole model felt like a sales funnel where you cast your net wide. And this is how business works, right? You cast your net to a wide audience. And then once you cast your net to that wide audience, you're going to have a percentage of that audience that responds. So now the net gets a little bit slimmer. These are the people who give you their attention. And then once you have the people who give you their attention, you're going to have a smaller percentage of people who give you their time, their information, right? And then you're going to have a smaller percentage of people who convert. Again, this is business language into they actually purchase your product. And then the funnel just keeps going from there. And the whole evangelistic process, the way it was framed, the way it was structured, the messaging around it, the advertising, even parts that I didn't have anything actively to do with, just really felt like a giant sales funnel that was designed to attract a specific type of person. And I remember the first night that I did the evangelistic series, we had a lot of really weird backwoods conspiracy theory type of people show up because it was like, oh, prophecy seminar with all the beasts on the flyer. I didn't make the flyers, I think they were handbills. And everything about it, the language, the style of the art, even the photography, the pictures they took of myself and the other speaker, all of it was geared to attract a particular type of audience that was already religious and probably, like I said, sort of into conspiracy theories and stuff. I don't know if that was done on purpose by the people leading. I think sometimes we are the, what's the word I'm looking for? We inherit what previous generations have
Yeah.
done, and we do it without thinking.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that was what the system was like, and that's what the whole thing was set up like. And I remember I was teamed up with another young lady who was in the theology department, and we had a conversation at one point because they even gave us the sermons to preach. They were like, these are the sermons that the slides and the content. And I sat down with her. Her name was Michelle, and I said, I can't preach these sermons. Like, there's no way. Like, I got to edit this stuff big time. And I was really thankful because she felt the same way. So we edited the sermons and made them our own and
Mm.
did the best we could with the situation that we had. But at least for me, when it was over, I was like, no. Like, if evangelism means I have to work within this system this template that's been pre-designed, there's no way I can do that. And so I found the whole experience to really confirm where I already was in my heart, which I found really strange because none of this had happened when that sort of experience of I don't want to be an evangelist anymore began to take place. None of this didn't happen for a year until a year after that, right? Roughly a year. And so when it finished, I was like, God, so then what in the world do you want me to do? You know, like, I don't want to be an evangelist. I don't know that I'm necessarily interested in music ministry anymore or youth ministry. I don't mind doing it for a little while, but I don't know if that's my calling. Like, what's my calling? Um, and that's when God started taking me back to experiences that I had had even before I went to university, when I was a soldier and I was sharing the gospel with people in my unit, with other troops that were in Iraq with me, and I would share the gospel with them. And a lot of them had never been to church before. They'd never read a Bible before. And if they had a lot of religious trauma based on what they experienced, whether it
Mm.
was a toxic culture, very harmful theology, harmful messaging. So I was encountering one of those two. Either you've never been to church before, or you've been and you had a really bad experience. So you were either unchurched or de-churched, is what I refer to them as. And what I found was none of the evangelistic stuff, this whole system and this whole process that I just did, that wouldn't work for these guys that I was sharing the gospel with at all. They would not be
Mm.
attracted to those flyers. They would not be attracted to the systems that were built around it and the local church cultures that they were being invited into. They would certainly not be attracted to the messaging had my friend and I not sort of edited. And so I kind of looked at that and I thought, okay, well, how do you reach these guys then? And these girls who are completely detached from any semblance of religious imagination, or whose religious imagination is actually painted by the traumatic experiences that they had. And that's when God really started to water this seed that was already in my heart. He'd already put it there many years before. I just didn't know. And it was a desire to share the gospel and the good news of Jesus with people who are either not religious at all, they've never been in religious environments at all, or the religious experiences that they had were very harmful. And so this is essentially what I refer to as post-church mission, right? Sharing the gospel with people who live in a society that's post-church. And what I mean by that is there was once a time where Western society was a very churched society. Church was the center of social imagination. And then church was removed as the center of social imagination. It was replaced by science. And even more recently, it was replaced by postmodernism and just whatever cultural conventions that you admire the most. So there was no center, basically. And generations who are being raised either in the scientific or postmodern uh, sort of phase of Western history tend to either have no experience with church whatsoever, or their experience with church has been very negative and they've just left, right? And so that's what I mean by post-church mission. It's mission to that group of people. And I'm talking groups of people that you open the Bible in front of them and they're like, why are there little numbers in the text? Like they've never
Yeah.
seen a verse before. Or I tell them
Yeah.
I'm a pastor and they're like, what is that? Never heard of a pastor. And Australia is very, very, very post church. And so
Mm.
that's the burden that got put in my heart. Like, I want you to reach out to this group of people. I want you to root the gospel in this demographic. And so I moved out to Australia and became a pastor here with that vision in mind. Um, the challenge that I found was that it's not possible to reach a post-church society by being a religious guru. They're not interested in religious gurus. They're not interested in the guy who has all the answers. The only way to effectively reach a post-church society is through safe communities. And that's where the difficulty came in, because the vast majority of the local churches that I was working in were not safe communities. And they were especially not safe communities for post-church seekers. And that became a really, really, really big challenge for ministry, for me anyway. So anyways, I've talked a lot. I'll pause there. you know, if I don't stop myself, bro, I'll just keep going like a runaway train.
No, 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 no. You're good. Um, so what and thank you for sharing this. It seems
Mm,
so, just to understand, the Lord was calling you to ministry,
yep.
to reach these specific people that you personally have a burden for, or the Lord has put that burden on your heart. And it caught my attention that you said that there in your position, you were not able to reach that demographic.
Mm,
Um, and I agree with you, Marcos. I think, I don't think that only the SDA church, the Seventh Day Adventist Church, has that problem. I think that a lot of other denominations have that problem
yeah,
as well, right?
100%.
Where
Yeah.
we have the labels for each of these things. So those who don't eat pork, those who, don't work on the Sabbath, and those who speak tongues, and we have all of these labels, and of course there's conspiracy theories and the dragons. I remember when I preached those messages that you're talking about, I preached them too.
Yep.
Because they give it to us. They give us the script to preach
Mm,
it in a certain way. And they were not 20, 30 minutes. They were an hour long.
yeah. Yeah.
And I hear you. I hear you when you say that, when you speak about the funnel.
Mm,
Um, and I am so glad that you have been able to identify the group of people that God wants you to reach. And it is unfortunate at the same time that you are not able to do it within the system, because the
mm,
system itself kind of is not only the system but also the communities. And it
yeah.
is, and it's kind of contradictory, because like when Jesus came, right, I feel that the gospel is about safe communities, not only for a certain type of people, but for everybody.
Mm,
But it's so hard to have a safe community for everybody nowadays, right?
yeah. Absolutely. And let me add something to that, because I mentioned earlier that I planted a very innovative and new type of church.
True.
And and the leadership in Australia was very supportive of that. In fact, they even funded I got funding from the AUC for the first 5 years to give me a 50% allocation to this church plant, so that I could do it, right. And of course, my leaders here in Western Australia also very supportive, and all of that. What part of what prompted the resignation, though, or the transitioning out of church employment, was that, and this is not any one particular person's fault, right? I think it's just sort of a challenge within the system. So what happened was, it got to the point where, as a conference, there were staffing shortages. And when there are staffing shortages, then you have to give the people who are in your employ more roles, in order, because you have a staffing shortage. And what I found particularly in the last year was, I had to take on a new role, and it was a good role, right? It wasn't a bad role whatsoever. I was asked to be a chaplain at a high school, And again, it wasn't a bad role. It was a really good role. There were a lot of really good parts to it. And I was really thankful that my leaders were like, look, let's not put Marcus in another fundamentalist church. That's not going to end well. Let's find someplace where he'll at least fit in better. I was like so thankful for that, right?
Wait, were you
But
planting
what
a
I
church
found,
and also had other churches?
yeah, oh yeah, 100%, man, and that's kind of
Like
normal.
established churches?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
when I first planted the church, I had two other established churches, and then it came
Mm,
down to one. And then they
okay,
took that other one away, and that's when I became the chaplain at this high school. So there were all
gotcha.
these things, right? The one thing though that never seemed possible was I was never going to be able to 100% focus on this missional movement. It was just never going to happen. And it wasn't any one person's fault. It was just the way the system was, right? There were staffing shortages and you had to give people extra roles, and that's just all there was to it. And what I found was it was getting harder and harder to actually effectively lead a missional community with the other expectations I had as a pastor. So whether that is another role that I had, meetings I had to go to, et cetera, et cetera. There were just big challenges around that. And so I really kind of got to this point where I realized, look, the only way I'm going to be able to dedicate myself full time to missional movement is if I'm not employed by the denomination anymore. Now, of course, I'm going to have to make money some other way. That's true, but at least I can set it up in a way where I'm not stretched so thin, and always feeling like I have to do this and I have to do that and I have to go over there. And you never know as a pastor either when the new year comes if they're going to add more. So that's an extra stress. And I was already struggling to give the missional network the attention that it needed. And it was just like, look, I'm just not going to know. Next year they might give me something else on top of the chaplaincy. I just don't know. It's always possible. And I think it's just one of the challenges of the system. And bright minds need to resolve that, right? And that's another factor that played in. So for me, I've never come into ministry with the goal of I'm going to pastor for a certain number of years, and then I'm going to work in my local conference, and then I'm going to move up to the union, and then I'm going to move up to the division, and then maybe someday I'll be in the GC, or I'll go teach in the university. That was never ever my goal. I came into ministry with one goal, and that is I want to reach post church culture for Christ. And I found that that goal was consistently met by obstacles. And the obstacles would be fine if my end goal was I'm going to get into the union and then help shape policy and help fix some of these problems in the church, which I think we need people doing that. But that's just not me. Right. And
Yeah.
and I kind of sat back one day and I realized, I can do exactly what God called me to do right now and do it
Mm.
better if I'm not an employee, you know. And another big challenge that was a part of what led me to wrestle with these things as well was it's very difficult as a church employee to do creative things. There's policies that are in place, policies that come from the GC that make that hard. I don't know why they're there. I mean, I can kind of figure why they're there, and I want to be fair toward the people who put these policies in place, because I'm sure, at least in their minds, they're trying to help.
Yeah.
But for me, I found them very restrictive. So any book that I write, anything that I record, any content that I create, I've got to do intellectual property agreements, have to walk through all this red tape. And to their credit, my local leaders were really helpful in trying to make that as pain-free a process as possible, but it was still hard. It got to the point where I had manuscripts written just sitting on my desktop that I didn't want to publish because I just couldn't be bothered with all the red tape and all the stuff I had to go through just to get it out there. And then there was a point where I thought, well, maybe I'll just send the manuscripts to an actual Adventist publisher. Maybe there's less red tape if I do that. So I contacted a publisher 3 times and just never heard back. I'd waited for a year and a half and just hadn't heard back. And I remember some years ago, Sergio, someone asked me this question. I was 34 years old at the time.
Mm.
And someone asked me, how many weeks of life do you think you have left? And I just kind of
Mm.
sat there and I thought, I don't know, 34, maybe I'll make it to 80, like 20,000. I don't know. That seems pretty reasonable to me, right? And then the guy was like, all right, pull out your calculator, right? So I pulled out my calculator and he walked me through the process. He said, if you make it to 80, and I might live longer than that, but usually your influence kind of dies at that point, right? So if you make it to 80 and you're 34 years old, that means you have 46 years left, right? So you multiply that by the number of weeks in a year, which roughly speaking is, 52 weeks, right? And so I did that, 46 years by 52 weeks. That's going to tell me exactly how many weeks of life I have left. Now, remember, I initially said 20,000 as my guess.
Yeah.
And then I looked at the calculator and I was like, 46 years left till I get to 80 by 52 weeks.
Like,
That is 2,392 weeks of life that I have left.
now,
That's it. Bro.
When you put it 2,000 weeks, man, that's nothing.
That's nothing.
That's
I thought, like, my initial
nothing.
reaction was, oh, I got 20,000 weeks left. And then I saw 2,300. And that's when I was 34, right? I'm 38 now. So it's less than that. 2,392 weeks left. That's it. And I'll tell you what, bro. I saw that and I thought to myself, that's nothing. 2,000 weeks. I don't have time to play politics, bro. I don't have time to play games. Do you know how many retired pastors I have heard at pastors' meetings who are in their 70s say, I'm retired now, and because I'm retired, I can actually say what I think.
Mercy.
So here's what I think will really help the church. What you're telling me is for 40 plus years, you couldn't say, and I'm not talking about toxic people just dropping criticisms just to be toxic, right? I'm talking about committed leaders who couldn't actually say, this is what's going to help our church because they were employed. They had to wait until they were retired. They had to wait until they have 500 weeks left maybe before they could actually say something at a point in their life where a lot less people are actually listening to them. Because they're at retirement age, right? I wish society wasn't like that, right? I wish we listened to our elders a lot more, but that's just the reality of our society. We tend to listen less as you get to that age, right? And I just thought to myself, no, I'm not going to play that game, man. Like, I'm not going to wait until I'm 70 to actually say, guys, here's the real issues. Let's work on this because I'm constrained by some false sense of institutional loyalty. It's like, no, my loyalty isn't to an institution. My loyalty is to the gospel. My loyalty is to humanity. My loyalty is to Christ. And if that means I have to say things to the institution that will enable it to lift up Jesus better, serve humanity better, and spread the gospel better, I should be able to say it now, not when I retire. And it's like, with only 2,000 weeks, man, I'm sorry, man, I'm not playing these games, and so, again, there's a lot of factors that sort of played into it. And I just decided, I think I've learned a lot in the last 10 years and I've had a great experience, and there's been a lot of good things that have happened and hurtful things as well. But I think I'm at this point where I want to do more for the kingdom of God. And I can do more if I'm not employed by the church. And so that's the step that I took. I wish that wasn't true. I wish it wasn't true. Like, look, bro, it's hard. You step out of church employment and it's like, my only degrees are theology and biblical languages. I ain't getting a job nowhere else. You know what I mean? Ain't nobody else going to hire me. And when you work for the church, you have a guaranteed paycheck.
And that's one of the reasons why a lot of these pastors, when they get to an age, when they get to an age, they're like, I can't get another job anywhere else. So even though I am not completely happy with this and I am not in agreement with the things that is going on, I am not going to quit because I got to provide for my family.
Absolutely.
So their choice are very limited, and then they stay with the status quo, right? With doing, just going with the flow. So it really takes guts to say, I am going to quit, even though I don't have any other degree and I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I'm going to quit. and still, and I want to say this, still to do ministry. And it's even sadder for that reason, right? Like we
Yeah.
should stay to continue doing ministry, but sometimes
Mm.
not only there are more obstacles with it than without it, which is
Yeah. And I would say this, if you are a pastor or an up and coming pastor, you're in school and you have a passion for working with believers. You want to work with believers and with churches. And you're not necessarily thinking about innovation, creativity, redesign. You just want to work in some local churches, build some good relationships, do some weddings, do some funerals, preach, you know, and then move on to another district. And there's people who do that, right? Like they do that from district to district and then they retire. Then yeah, like there's nothing wrong with that. You need people that do that, right?
yeah.
And if you're coming into ministry thinking I'd like to get into the offices at some point and actually be part of changing policy and shaping the future of the denomination, then you need to be an ordained minister and you need to go through the system and you need to, like 100%. I never want to discourage anyone from doing that. But if your passion is, I want to reach people, I want to reach this emerging generation that is unchurched and dechurched, a generation of people that have no interest in religious ideology, no interest in institutional loyalty, no interest in what's the word I'm looking for, belonging to a denomination. And that's a huge thing. Less and less people today are interested in denominational identity. It's not
Yeah.
like it was, like back in the 50s. If you had a job in the 50s, you would get a job at a factory and you would work there your whole life. And if
Hmm.
someone offered you the same job with better pay, you were less likely to take it. Why? Because you were loyal to your company. You were
Yeah.
loyal to the brand, to the people who employed you, who had
Mm.
helped you all this time, right? It's not like that anymore. But the thing is, that culture bled into how people thought about religion. I'm loyal as a Baptist. I'm loyal as a Catholic. I'm loyal as an Adventist. I'm loyal as a Pentecostal. And there's still
Mm.
some degree of that with people who are already religious. But with people who are raised in irreligious context, there's just no brand loyalty or loyalty to institutions in in their regular life, and they're certainly not looking to start in their religious or spiritual life, right? They're interested in truth, they're interested in God, they're interested, in Jesus, they're interested in what the Bible teaches, those who are seeking in that space, right? But they're not interested in joining your church. They're not interested in putting, I am a Seventh Day Adventist.
Mm.
My dad's generation was like that. It's like they're proud. It's like, I am a Seventh Day Adventist. Like he told my kids that one day. They were talking on the phone, and he's like, "You are a Seventh Day Adventist," and my kids were like, "Man," like now they're part of our family, they're part of our community, they come to all our churches, but they're just like, what's up with the label, bro? Like that's kind of intense. And that's just the thing, that's just the reality of it. You can kick and scream about it, but that's the reality of it. Emerging generations are interested in those labels. And so if you want to reach those people, you can do a lot more if you're not employed by the denomination, because there's just a lot of restraints in working for the denomination. One big example, and this is a conversation I've had with lots and lots and lots of young pastors over the years, not only in Australia but just around the world, and that is that 9 times out of 10, when you become a pastor in the denomination, you are placed in a district, and there are very few districts that are healthy and innovative. Very, very few. In fact, there's very few churches alone that are like that, let alone a district, right? Most districts, all of your churches are aging. They're fundamentalist. They're ultra conservative. They don't want to try new ideas. They don't want to allow the youth to lead things. They cause headaches and problems for anyone and everyone who tries to change things. And that's where 24-year-old you with a desire to change the world and root the gospel in the city, that's where you end up. And what that means is that 95% of your time is spent in appeasing a group of people who should be speaking the gospel into the city, but who have just created this culture of exclusion and a table where only they belong. and you have to now work with these people and spend all your time, 20 hours a week writing a sermon to preach to these people, and then, board meetings and business meetings, and it's the same old thing year after year. And it's no wonder that most young pastors just, they're just like,
Give
nah,
up.
man, this ain't it. I'm not doing it.
It's not for
I've talked to
me.
quite a few pastors,
Yeah.
including some of the guys that I knew when I was back in America, really, really talented guys who have left ministry. They're in business coaching now. They're in different fields of employment and work, because where I work now, and this is the sort of the ideas that I've heard from many of those conversations, is where I work now, it values creativity, it values innovation, it values forward thinking. I can actually use my gifts here. But when I
Wow.
was working for the denomination, I couldn't, man. Everything was stonewalled, everything was blocked, everything was criticized, and I just couldn't take it anymore. Now, are those guys, did they give up on God? Did they give up on the message? Did they give up on building the kingdom? No, absolutely not. They're still 100%
Mm.
doing that. They're just doing that in their own capacity as itinerant gospel workers, right? As opposed to, I work for the denomination. And that's just a sad reality, man. And, these are the kinds of things when you're employed, it's like, oh, I can't say that. I have to make the, institution look good. It's like, I don't want to make the institution look bad, because I'm not anti-institutional and I'm not anti any of those things. Some of these like independent ministries
Yeah.
are always taking stabs at the church. I can't stand those people, man. Those people need to go see a therapist. But I think that there's the truth that there's some uncomfortable things we have to wrestle with, man. And the real
Yeah.
uncomfortable reality is that most young pastors get stuck in districts with toxic people. And what is the life expectancy of these young pastors going to be? It's not going to be long, man. It's not going to be long.
Mm.
I was able to put up with it. I put up with it for 10 years, and I was able to, I think, I have a background in the military. I was an Army sergeant, and I grew up in Jersey. I have slightly thick skin. So I think I was able to put up with it, but not everyone can.
Yeah.
Um, and unless you're
Mm.
into that sort of thing, unless you are a fundamentalist conservative, you're like, I love this, and yeah, you'll fit right in, but anyone else, it's a struggle, man. It's a struggle. And so a lot of guys then see, and I heard this conversation so many times among pastors as well. A lot of pastors see a position of administration in the office. They want one, they envy one, they long for one. Why? Because it gets them out of the local church. They don't want to be
Mm.
in the local church. The local church is traumatizing, man. Like, they don't want to be there. So, what is the solution to this? I think that's a really big conversation. I won't go into that answer right now, but I will say this. There's two things that I focus on now that I'm not employed by the church. First of all, I still work with my church plant. I'm not the sort of like the lead pastor anymore, but I still work with it. I still train and equip missionaries. That's a big part of it. But outside of that, my wife and I have started a practice together in religious trauma coaching and therapy. My wife is a psychotherapist. So we started a podcast, launched an app, and we also have a practice where we help people who have religious trauma. The goal of this practice isn't to make people Adventist. It's just to help people heal, right? It's
Mm.
particularly people who want to heal, but they still want a relationship with God, and they have some layers they have to sort through. That's what we do. She approaches it from a psychotherapeutic perspective. I approach it from a religious trauma coaching perspective, and we just help people heal and help people recover. And so that's part of that's part of the what I'm doing now that I'm not employed by the church. And the other part is I continue to train post-church missionaries into creating and cultivating new churches with new cultures that are safe, inclusive, and just. And I think through that two-prong approach, we hope to continue to bless the church and to bless the gospel mission without necessarily being employed by it. But yeah, so like, what's one thing that I could say in terms of how do we fix this within the denomination? I think, again, that's a very complex conversation, but if there's one thing that we need to fix, I think it's our messaging. And I'll give you an example. Matthew Lucio, who leads the Adventist History podcast, shared an article a couple of years ago, I believe. And in that article, he talked about an evangelist who was very famous in the late 80s, early 90s in Oregon. I don't remember the evangelist's name, but the evangelist was very well known. He always had lots of baptisms. And one of his sermons that he would preach He used a lot of copywriting techniques, a lot of NLP, neurological language patterns, a lot of sales funnels as part of his preaching. And that's how he was getting all these baptisms. He was essentially a salesman. And in one of his sermons, he would invite people, because he would always like talk up the next sermon so that people would come back. And one of them, this was his sales pitch: come back tomorrow night, and I'm going to name to you 3 pastors in this city who will not be going to heaven.
Wow.
Now, let me ask you, Sergio, who is showing up the next night? Are your emotionally healthy, critical thinking, relationally driven, compassionate minded people coming? No. If they heard that, they'd be like, this ain't for me.
I'm not coming back.
You know who's coming? The people who are toxic, unhealthy, emotionally unstable, and judgmental. They're the ones where I would love to know who the 3 preachers in this city who aren't going to heaven are. Tell me, right? They're the ones who are coming. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not trying to say that emotionally unstable people shouldn't be reached by the church. They should definitely be reached. We're all emotionally unstable, man. Like, you know,
Yeah,
like we all need to
say that again.
We all need Jesus. The difference is, this isn't reaching emotionally unstable people. This is exploiting them. You're exploiting their instabilities for numbers. And then here's what happens. You keep this toxic messaging up and you baptize those people. Those people, say you baptize 20, 30 people, those people now become the nucleus of a new local church. And what kind of culture do you think that local church is going to have? Is it going to have a culture of people who want to serve one another, who want to serve their city, who want to lay their lives down like an offering for the people around them who are hurting? Or is it going to be a culture of people who want to gossip and judge and condemn, and whose idea of a good preacher is only the preacher who stands up on the podium and throws stones at everyone who doesn't agree with us, right? That's the kind of culture you're going to end up with. And then you multiply that, because this was our evangelistic sort of sales funnel for many years. You multiply that by 1,000, and you pretty much have an explanation for 90% of our local churches as a denomination. That's what they are, man. And it's not their fault. They're humans. They're people who are searching for answers. They're people who are searching for healing. But rather than finding healing, they were marketed to by sales funnels and messaging that just basically hooked in on their pain points and dragged them along with this toxic messaging. And now they form communities that just perpetuate the same trauma cycles. It's this type of trauma bonding, really. And if we're going to have a healthier church in the future, I'm not sure you can do anything about the communities that are already established under those parameters. But if we change our messaging and we recognize the harm that this has caused, and we reframe and allow ourselves to speak the true gospel and the true healing message, we can cultivate new communities, and those new communities will eventually become the norm. That's what I hope. That's what I desire. That's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it's something that desperately needs to happen, because we can't keep going the way we're going, man. It's not it. It's not it, bro.
Let me ask you something, and why do you think that you have, or that you've always had the desire to reach that demographics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was raised in a traditional fundamentalist Adventist Latino church. And let me tell you, man, there is no fundamentalist controlling church like a Latino fundamentalist controlling church. Like, it's really funny, bro, because I didn't know these things when I was younger. I had no idea. I remember the first time I went to a Caucasian church, an Anglo church. I was like, yo, this is pretty chill. I mean, they're traditional like the people I grew up with, but they're pretty relaxed. This ain't that bad, you know? I appreciated the fact that even though they were traditional and conservative, they weren't aggressive about it. They were just chill. And now these are the churches I visited. I'm not saying they're all Anglo churches like these are just the ones I visited. And one day I got to thinking, I wonder why the Latino churches are so intense, when it comes to this stuff, and the Anglo churches aren't, because the Anglos are the ones who introduced this stuff, and that's when I began to understand.
They're the ones who brought it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And that's when I began to understand the impact of colonization and the loss of identity and the trauma, the generational trauma that it leaves behind. And I think that's part of the reason why Latino churches tend to be 10 times more aggressive than Anglo churches, even though historically it was the Anglo churches that were the ones doing the colonizing. And I think it's because there's a loss of identity, there's a loss of culture when you are colonized. And that brings with it a degree of trauma, generational trauma that gets passed on from generation to generation. And people often, is a trauma response to try and control other people, and so you see that really heavy, at least in the Latino churches I grew up in and I went to. I'm not saying everyone is like that, but that's a big thing. It's a trauma response to want to control people and to be aggressive about your belief systems. That doesn't come from a place of security. It comes from a place of insecurity. And so it gave me a little bit of compassion. I was like, okay, I understand. I don't excuse what goes on in a lot of Latino churches. They're
But
very
there's
intense, but
understanding.
I can understand why it's happening, because a lot of them come from generations of colonization, right? A lot of the indigenous peoples in
Man.
Latino
Hmm.
cultures had everything taken from them and destroyed and stolen, and a lot of their ancestors or family members killed and forcefully converted. And you fast forward a few hundred years, and that trauma is still reeling. I don't know why I got onto that, but how do I get off of it now? The question that you asked. So I grew up in that church. I grew up, that was my culture, and I thought it was normal. When I joined the military and I got stationed, stationed in Hawaii, in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people from all walks of life, all
Mm.
cultures, right? There were African Americans, there were Asians, there were Native Americans, there were people from different, not only ethnic backgrounds, but also subcultural backgrounds. Like there were people who were more emo, there were people who were more, goth, there were ideological diversity, there were people who were atheists, agnostics. And was having conversations with all of them, because one thing that I absolutely loved about the military is just you can develop really close friendships with your mates. It's just the thing, it's just one of those things that happens in the military. So you get into these really deep conversations with everyone around you. And I started to realize, man, none of the stuff that I was raised with in terms of this is how you tell people about God, none of it works. None of it.
Mm.
If anything, the assumptions that undergird
Mm.
the approach to sharing God that I was raised with were exposed as very vacuous and very flimsy. They assume a pre-modern context. And what I mean by pre-modern, for those who don't know what that means, is there was a time in society where everyone assumed that the sacred text and the religious figure were where truth was found. You found truth in the sacred text and the religious figure. And I grew up in a society like that. I grew up in a context like that. Latino context was pre-modern, meaning we assumed naturally that you found truth in the Bible and you found truth in the pastor or the priest or whatever the religious figure was, right? And so what that means is, in a Latino context, not everybody goes to church, but at least in I like the Latino church world is evolving as well, so this is all changing. But at least at that time, even if you didn't go to church, you still revered the book and the priest or the pastor. You still had a certain level of respect and admiration for them. So we had a guy who was like in the same neighborhood as the church, who was like the local drunk, right? He was always drunk. And he would see the pastor and he would hide his bottle. He's like, "Oh, pastor, I'm sorry. Let me put this away. Hey, how you doing?" He never came to church. But there was a part of him that was like, "Oh, this is I'm in the presence of the sacred man. So let me put this away because this is bad," right? That's a pre-modern world. And the way you share the gospel in a pre-modern world is contextualized to a pre-modern world, because everybody already believes that God exists. They believe that there's a sacred truth in reality, and they believe that it's contained within the sacred text, which for us was the Bible, right? Now, when you go into a modern world, that's very different, because in a modern world, people don't believe, they believe truth exists, but it's found in science. It's not found in a sacred text or in a sacred person like a priest or a pastor. In fact, those things are idiotic, right? Bible's full of myths and the priests and pastors need to go get a real job, right? Like that's the modern world. Truth is found in science.
Yeah.
So how do you share the gospel in that context? You can't share the gospel by saying the Bible says, because no one cares what the Bible says, right? That works in a pre-modern context. In a modern context, you have to use a more apologetic approach where you're actually engaging people at the level of science, at the level of philosophy, and you're sort of like creating a marketplace of ideas where you can dialogue with some of these deep concepts. But what happens when the world's no longer modern and it becomes postmodern, which is what began happening from after World War II, from the 50s onwards, where people, pre-modernism and modernism had one thing in common. They both believed that truth was real. They just disagreed on where the source was. Pre-modernism said it was the Bible. Modernism said it was science. Now you have postmodernism, and postmodernism says, you know what? It's not that the source of truth is different, is that truth doesn't even exist. There is no truth. In fact, anytime someone claims to have the truth, it's because they're trying to oppress and control you. So we need to deconstruct this whole concept of truth and just throw it away, because there's no such thing as truth. It's nonsense.
Subjective, right? Too.
Yeah. And so now you have a whole new generation being raised with they can agree on one thing. There's no such thing as truth, right? Truth is relative. How do you share the gospel in that context? You can't use apologetics, because apologetics assumes there's truth. You can't say the Bible says, because that assumes the Bible's true. In fact, postmodernism in the more intense iterations even suggests that words have no meaning. So you're opening the Bible to people who are like, yeah, but these words don't really have meaning. Language has no meaning. And so how do you share the gospel in that context? You have to adapt you have to adopt the way that you share the gospel. You have to contextualize. You have to find ways of communicating truth to diverse people so that they can understand it without you sounding like you're speaking a totally different language the moment you open your mouth, right? And so this is what I encountered when I was in the military, particularly the modernist sort of age was in full swing because of the what was it called? The New Atheist movement. So Dawkins and Hitchens and all these guys, right? Like, and Sam Harris. There was the New Atheism was like really, really, really big in the early 2000s. Now, don't get me wrong. Historically speaking, society by and large was already very postmodern by that time. But the New Atheist movement was really impactful. So yeah, I had a lot of these young guys in the army with me who were really into this modernist New Atheist thing. And if they weren't, they were definitely postmodernists who just didn't believe that truth was a thing, didn't believe that anyone could claim truth was a thing. So everything I was raised with was like, you share the gospel like this, but it was like to a pre-modern world. Now I'm in a modern, postmodern world, and I don't know what the heck to do. I'm like, I don't know how to tell these people about God. And without knowing anything I didn't know anything about postmodernism and any of that until later when I started studying and I started understanding, oh, this is how history works. I was just this young guy in a unit in the army trying to figure out, how do I tell these guys about Jesus? They don't care. Like, none of my approaches work, I even ended up arguing with a guy one time, and that didn't end well. That was a loss. So anyways, I was just praying about it and saying, God, how do I do this? And God began teaching me the relational approach of connecting with people at the level of relationship, at the level of heart, of building true connection, of seeing the humanity in people, of recognizing the fingerprints of God in their world, even though they were not Adventist, right? And they weren't even Christian, of recognizing that God was already in their world and his fingerprints were everywhere, and learning to identify those things and learning to build good relationships and help them see the heart of God through relationship instead of trying to pump a denomination, right? And I started having more success, not in the sense that I was baptizing people, but in the sense that people were actually listening now, right? Like, a lot of my mates were actually like paying attention and not walking off angry and, all these things. And so that's where it initially happened. But when I left the army and I got back into the Adventist bubble, I got back into the pre-modern bubble. I'm going to be an evangelist. I'm going to travel the world and I'm going to preach the angels' messages and boom, boom, boom. And that experience happened at university where God just ripped that out of me. He's like, no, that's not what I've called you to. I want you to be an evangelist to people who would never go to see an evangelist. and that requires an approach that I've already taught you. You just have to remember. So that's
Man,
the long.
Marcos.
Mm,
So it's interesting. You've never lost your faith in the truth and the good news of the gospel.
mm, yeah,
Um, you've always believed it truth despite of the religious trauma, despite of the obstacle, despite of the nonsense. Um, you just what I hear is you just want to be able to communicate this beautiful gospel that we have to those people who are not able or who may not lend an ear to me,
mm,
and perhaps even to the rest, well, to the majority of churches, of SDA churches, in our world. But perhaps communicating it in your way, they
yeah,
might just give Jesus a chance.
mm. Yeah,
That's what I'm
absolutely.
hearing you saying.
Yeah, and look, I have had seasons of deep wrestle because I'm a survivor of religious trauma myself, and that's a separate story. But I did go through a season of questioning my faith and suffering under the pain of coercive and abusive ideas about God that had impacted my mental health. I struggled with suicidal
Mm.
ideation, deep depression, anxiety. In fact, I was at Southern at this time. You just would never have guessed because
Wow.
I always looked happy, but I was struggling, man. I was
Man.
struggling big time. I had to go to therapy. I even had to go on medication. It was a very hard season. But through that process, what I began to discover was, and I discovered this through processes like deconstruction and decolonization. What I began to discover is that for a lot of people, religion and God are merely projections of themselves. They're projecting their own unprocessed traumas onto what they refer to as God, onto what they refer to as truth. And we all do it. I do it too. But what
Mm.
I began to discover was, although you can't do it perfectly because we live in a, fallen world, if you can identify that and you can identify the ways in which you do it as well, and you can go on a journey of saying, God, I need to deconstruct the ideas that I have about you. I need to decolonize these ideas as well. But over and beyond that, I need to deproject the picture that I have of you so that I can get a clearer glimpse of who you really are. And man, let me tell you, bro, there's only one way to do that, and it's through Jesus. Like, that's it. Like,
Amen.
like you try and deproject God in
Mm.
any other way, you're just going to end up projecting something new onto him. Jesus is the clearest revelation of the Father. And the more I looked
Amen.
at Jesus, the more in love, I was like, oh my goodness, if this is what
Amen.
God is really like. And I struggled, there were times where I was like, is it true? Is it not? But when I went through that journey of deconstruction, decolonization, and deprojection, I really began to see the heart of God for what it was.
Mm.
And it gave me compassion for those people like myself who project images of God that are really just versions of themselves, right?
Mm.
Um, it gave me compassion because I realized, like, I do it too, like we all do it. But it also gave me just a really deep appreciation for the way of Jesus, because it's like, wow, I don't think people realize how radical. There's a reason why Jesus was killed. The picture of God, the image of God that Jesus portrayed in his ministry wasn't just religiously uncomfortable for the religious elite in Jerusalem. It threatened the social stability of Judean Roman relations.
Man.
It threatened the social structures. It threatened
Mm.
the scaffolds that they had constructed their entire empire around, and their entire future and economy. It was too much. This is why Caiaphas said, better that one man die than the whole nation perish, because he really believed if we keep letting Jesus go on, we're going to perish as a nation. He's the end
Oof.
of
Oof.
us.
Eh.
And
Mm.
and really fundamentally, that's Jesus, man. He's the end of all that man has built, but the beginning of what we were always meant to build, which is a table where we all belong. a
Yeah.
place of compassion and kindness, and a home for all of us. That's what Jesus was doing. And when I started to see that, I was like, yo, wait a minute. Dang, dude. It changed everything. And I realized, like, Jesus is the lens. He's the
Amen.
portal to a true understanding of God's heart. And I say that in the most politically incorrect way. There's nothing else like Jesus. Um, and that really helped sustain me, even in the seasons where I just wanted to be like, yo, forget all this, forget religion, I'm just chucking the whole thing away. And I think to a certain degree I did chuck religion away, but I couldn't get rid of Jesus.
Wow.
That was what I was looking for. That's what my heart was looking for. So yeah, man. Yeah, so anyway, sorry, probably went on
No,
about that
no,
one a
no,
bit too
no.
long, but
Let me
yeah.
ask you this. A lot of our viewers are church members. Um, what what would you say to our viewers who sit in church pews, on a weekly basis? Um, what would you say to them? What would your message be to them?
Yeah, I think that depends on where they're at. If let me just speak to someone who is where I was with what I just described, suffering through religious trauma. A lot of times we don't recognize this in our denomination. When people are struggling severely with assurance of salvation, that's not merely a theological problem.
Mm,
I've talked to lots of people like this. You give them all the Bible studies on assurance of salvation, and sometimes it just doesn't click. We're not just dealing with a theological problem here. We're dealing with a psychological, a psychotherapeutic uh, disharmony and imbalance.
man.
And sometimes we try and fix this stuff with sermons and Bible studies, and it's a lot deeper than that.
Mm,
And so I would say to anyone who's in that space, who's feeling that tension, who's feeling that pain, maybe you're anxious, maybe you're depressed, maybe you're developing, maybe you have obsessive compulsions around religion and spirituality and your relationship with God. First of all, I would say there is definitely a way out. There is a way to heal. And that way to heal doesn't require you to throw away your faith, but it does require a deep journey of decolonization, deconstruction, and deprojection as well. And that on the other side of that journey, which is a journey you take with Jesus, man, is a healing teaching. I call them the healing teachings of Jesus, right? The word doctrine, I actually read this many years ago and I never forgot it. The word doctrine etymologically comes from the same root as the word doctor. So doctor, the word doctrine means teaching, but etymologically it's also tied to the word doctor. And I read this somewhere, I don't remember where, but the author basically said, if you think about it, that means that true doctrine is a healing teaching, right? It's not
wow.
just a teaching, it's a healing teaching.
I love it.
And that this is what Jesus came to offer humanity. He came to offer us healing teachings, right? True doctrine is in Jesus and through Jesus, because that's where the healing comes from. And that would be my biggest sort of suggestion, if I could call it that, is just get really close to Jesus, get
Amen.
to know Jesus, dive deep into Jesus, immerse yourself in Jesus, hydrate yourself in Jesus, and
Amen.
learn to see everything through Jesus, because
Mm,
that's where the healing is. When you do that, you begin to identify his healing teachings, and you begin to identify that through him, all of scripture is healing. Let me tell you this, man. I said this to a friend of mine the other day, and I stand by it 100%. Without Jesus, the Bible is just another religious book
mm,
full of
mercy.
wise ideas and violent stories. Jesus is what makes it different.
Beautiful.
And this is
Well said.
something that's so key in the New Testament. And a lot of people miss this. When Paul, for example, Saul, who became Paul, realized this, and Saul he was a scholar. He was a Pharisee, man. This guy had most of the Old Testament memorized. He realizes, wait a minute, I have to reread the entire thing through Jesus, because Jesus changes everything.
That's
Everything.
true.
And
That's true.
that's one of the things that you see throughout the New Testament, is this tension of like, wait a minute, Jesus, He changes everything. And then you get to this radical book, the book of Hebrews, man. Like, people debate who the author was. Uh, I'm more impressed with how radical the author was than with who he was. Because this guy was spitting some stuff that'll get you killed, man. He's like, Jesus is better than the angels. He's better than the patriarchs. He's better than Abraham. He's better than Moses. He's better than the law. He's better than the Levites. He's better than the temple, bro. Like, Jesus is better than the covenants. Like, dang, it's just like everything is being reauthored, recolored, rewritten, rediscovered
Love
through
it.
Jesus.
Mm.
My thing, man. It's like, go back to Jesus, see it all through Jesus. 100%.
Amen.
Mm.
Amen. Man, Marcus, and this part I'll probably, cut it out of the interview, but I have people close to my life who fit in that category that you're talking about. And for me it has been difficult to reach to them. And perhaps this conversation has facilitated or has sparked, something that will perhaps lead me to share Jesus with those individuals differently than what I was taught. Um, and something you said earlier was you can understand how some people might act a certain way because they inherit it. Inherit it. You don't excuse it, but you can understand it. I think in my ministry career, I was taught, right, that I needed to baptize, and the most important thing was to just baptize. And in my first year of Bible worker, like, we baptized close to 60 people in 1 year, in 12 months, and that was my focus, number one, with all those strategies that you mentioned, and it worked. But then, a year later, some of these folks were not in church anymore. And when I think back, I'm like, man, like Jesus and the gospel is so good that I must have perhaps, I don't know, preach a Jesus that was differently than what Jesus, or a gospel that what Jesus preached. But seeing it and thinking about even prophecies in the scripture, right? The 1200, what is it, the 144,000 and the beast and all of that is biblical. But the moment that we put Jesus out of there, it becomes, just something else. So I appreciate the conversation. If there are people who would like to learn, perhaps to reach a generation, in which you are reaching, how can they do it? You mentioned that you have a podcast with your wife. Are there any resources that you might consider and you might might have produced, or perhaps that you might recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two key resources that I have right now, two separate websites, and it really just depends on where you are. So if you are at a stage in your life where you're thinking, I really need to heal these God wounds and these church hurts, the religious trauma side of the equation, and that's sort of the priority in your life right now, you need to work through those things and heal those things, then we have a project that you can access at hungerpodcast.com. Hungerpodcast.com. So Hunger is a project that involves a podcast where we're just actually started season 1, which is Sacred Scars, Life After Religious Trauma. And that is co-hosted by myself and Candace, who's my partner. As I mentioned earlier, she's a psychotherapist. And so she brings a therapeutic angle and I bring the theological angle. We let these two sort of meet in the podcast as we explore healing
That's
from
awesome.
lies about God and harmful religions, etc. It's not just for Adventists, it's for anyone of any religious background whatsoever. In fact, this whole project is open to anyone. It's not just for Adventists. Um, but on top of that, this project, it has a podcast. It also has an app, and it's called Hunger, the devotional app. And it's a devotional app that's very different to most devotional apps. Most devotional apps like YouVersion, et cetera, tend to focus on just basic values, and they're good. They're good. But Hunger has a very specific focus on reading scripture, on seeing God with new eyes, right? So it's devotional plans and Bible courses that are really featured or focused on the character and the heart of God. And it's really designed for people who are healing from toxic religion, so that they can see scripture through a new lens, and they can see God in a new way, in a way that is actually in harmony with what Jesus came to reveal. So it talks a lot about, there's devotional plans that are audio as well as text. And there's also video courses that really just go on the journey of deconstruction, decolonization, and deprojection, really helping us to heal our understanding of scripture and our understanding of God. And of course, we also offer coaching and therapy for those who would like coaching or therapy. And there's more coming. We're going to be releasing workshops as well, and group sessions that's coming in the future. But you can access all of that on hungerpodcast.com. And once you get there, there's a survey. Actually, we really ask people to take the survey. It's called the Religious Trauma Type Survey. And it works through the 4 main types of religious trauma. There's 4 main types. There is theological religious trauma, which is, lies about God that you've been told, you've heard in sermons, etc., theological stuff. There's developmental religious trauma, which is caused by things like purity culture, shaming a person through their natural developmental stages, which tends to happen a lot in fundamentalist churches. So I'll give you an example. A natural part of human development, particularly through the teenage years, is you get to a point where you start to ask lots of questions because you're developing your own identity. You're separating your identity from your parents and your community. You're becoming your own person. And so a natural part of that is you ask lots of questions. Well, in fundamentalist communities, those questions tend to be shamed and shot down. You shouldn't be asking that. That's a bad thing. Don't do that. Don't ask those kinds of questions. Don't say those kinds of things. What happens in that environment is you actually repress a person's natural developmental process. And you can't repress that without harming them. And so that becomes a type of developmental religious trauma, right? There's sociological religious trauma, which is what happens from living with or growing up within societies or social communities that are very judgmental. And there's apocalyptic religious trauma, which I think a lot of Adventists relate to. It's the sort of, doom and gloom, end of the world, conspiracy theories, everything's evil type of mentality. Now, the reason why we ask everyone to take this quiz is because it helps us know how to best serve you. Gotcha. So, if everyone's saying, theological religious trauma is the number one thing we're all struggling with and not apocalyptic, then we're going to focus on theological and not focus on apocalyptic, et cetera, right? So all you do is put in your email and then take your quiz, and then we'll email you updates. You get a free book as well on religious trauma healing and a lot of good things. We're just trying to help people heal through this process. So hungerpodcast.com. And again, that's all about healing from religious trauma. The other project that I have is entirely different. And this one's focused more on the question that you asked. If I want to reach my friends, but I want to do it in a new way, in a way that is relevant to today. And I don't want to be doing the stuff that doesn't work anymore or the stuff that's offensive, that's harmful. How do I learn how to reach my friends in a new way? And for that, you have to go to another website, and that's thestorychurchproject.com.
Yeah.
Now, when you get to thestorychurchproject.com, there's a link called the Mission Collective or the online school, right? Tap on online school. That's going to take you to the Mission Collective and join the Mission Collective. Essentially, the Mission Collective is my online school. There's over 30 videos already, including resources, PowerPoints, PDFs. And I do live sessions on Sundays too on Zoom through the Mission Collective. So if you really want to learn how to reach people in a new way, how to share the gospel in ways that are effective and also healthy, definitely join the Mission Collective. They're not free. Obviously, I have to feed my kids. So I do charge it. The app, I believe, is the app is $4.99 a month, which is very, very cheap. And the online school, the Mission Collective, is $17.99 a month, which again, super affordable. Actually, I think it's just 17 flat, which is like $200 a year. Like super affordable.
Gotcha.
I like to keep things affordable because I recognize, I need to provide for my family,
Of
but I
course.
recognize as well that life's hard. So I'm not trying to charge much. But the more people get these resources, the more it enables us to create more and better resources because we have the financial base to do it. If people don't use them, if people don't subscribe to them, then we can't really do much more than what we're already doing. So please subscribe, if anything, just to support us and help us continue to create better and more effective resources in the future. So yeah, so those are the two things: hungerpodcast.com for religious trauma, thestorychurchproject.com for outreach, mission, discipleship, etc.
I'm glad, Marcos. I'm really glad that you are doing this because, like I said, I personally have people in my life who have shot away from the church, who have those religious traumas, and yet they tell me, "Hey, you might not see me in church, and you might not see me doing this, and you might even see me doing this other stuff, but I have a relationship with God,"
Mm-hmm.
which at one point, was so interesting to me seeing someone do something and at the same time say, "Oh no, God is this and God is that, and I have my own relationship with God."
Yeah.
So there's definitely a great audience, and I'm really hoping that those who are watching this may, I don't know how many of you who are watching this today have religious trauma, but thank you so much for sharing these resources and sharing your thoughts and sharing your experience. To be honest, I thought that, this conversation was going to be like, oh, the church did this to me, and, I'm done with the church and I left, which is the case of, a lot of people. But I found that you just wanted to reach, even more because you still have, you have a heart for a certain demographic of people who are in need of
Yeah.
hearing the gospel in a different way. And I just, man, hats off to you and to your wife.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for doing this. And I am 100% convinced that God has put this project in your hands and that He will bless it. And
Thank you, bro.
that because of you guys, we will see some people in heaven. I pray, and I will pass on those resources because, again, they are much, much, much needed. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Sergio, man. And thank you too for what you are doing. Absolutely incredible, man. And yeah, I pray that through your ministry, through the resources that you're creating, the same thing, man, that a lot of people will experience healing and restoration.
Amen.
I think it is, and you mentioned this earlier, it's not hard to sit here and just, you know, do a massive cathartic dump on the church. And, for people who are there, no judgment, man. Like, if that's where you're at in your journey and you just need to get all that stuff out, that's part of the journey, right? Sometimes you just need to get all that stuff out, and it sounds very toxic and negative, and but at the same time, it's part of the healing process, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oftentimes, if you have a wound that's infected, you got to clean it out, and it makes it worse. You get all that stuff out, and there's blood everywhere, and no one looks at that and says, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. Just leave it alone." It's like, no, clean it out. It makes things messy. There's blood everywhere. There's pus. It's disgusting. But
Yeah.
then you can actually start to mend it.
Yeah.
So if people are at that point in their journey where they're like, look, I've got this nasty wound and I need to clean it out. And here's how I'm going to clean it out. I'm going to tell you my story and all the terrible things the church did to me. That's, man, judgment free. Like, that's part of the journey. And I've been there. And
Yeah.
I think I'm just at a point now where in my relationship with God, I'm like, okay, all that being true, how shall I then live?
Yeah.
What's the next step here? And
Yeah.
understanding how trauma works and understanding how it impacts people, and then seeking to create and cultivate a space where we can heal and move forward and recover agency, autonomy, happiness, joy, enthusiasm. Is just where I'm at, you know. And yeah, and I'm just glad to be able to be here and to be able to share that with you, and super excited for what you're doing as well, man. So
Marcos, thank you so much, bro. I appreciate it. To all of those who are watching, thank you so much for watching. We usually like to finish the podcast with some random questions, but with you, man, I just want to ask you one thing.
okay.
Is Australia as crazy as they portrayed it in the internet? So everybody talks
Oh,
about that. Everybody talks about the most dangerous and venomous and all of these crazy animals are in store. Is that true?
well, let me tell you this. It's true. It's 100% true. Have I ever encountered it? No. The truth
Okay.
is, Australia is like any other country in the world. When you live in the urban areas that are pretty built up, you're less likely to encounter anything like that. Where I live in Perth,
Okay.
Western Australia, you know, there's snakes and there's spiders. I see the spiders sometimes. I've seen the snakes rarely. You know, they run away from that type of stuff. The vibrations and stuff scares them away. The further north you go, if you're going north toward the Northern Territory or toward Broome in Western Australia,
Yeah.
yeah, it can. There's crocs and just really crazy things. Yeah, and if you're in the eastern states in Queensland, oh, forget it. I'm never going to Queensland. Queensland is like Hawaii, but it will kill you.
Are you
So,
serious?
for all my Queensland
Dang.
friends, I'm sorry, man. I'm staying away, guys. I'm a city boy. I can't handle that.
You know, I recently got my scuba diving certification, and I hear that off the coast of well, one of the coasts of Australia, they have the largest reef. So
Mm.
I am, when I sharpen my skills, and if the Lord allows it, I'll one day I'll go there.
There you go, man. There you go. I look, for those of you who are into the sort of death defying things like that, I wish you the best. Take some pictures, send them to me.
Listen, I just remember what I was gonna say right before this section, and I'll edit this part. Religious trauma and the wounds that you're talking about, it expands to our interpersonal relationships that we have with other people, right?
100%.
Like it affects, I mean, it could, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking, how does religious trauma affect our marriages? How does
Mhm.
religious trauma affect those people who are raising children, right? Your relationship with your coworkers, your relationship with other people. Am I in the right track here? Does that sound
100%.
accurate?
100%. Yeah, yeah. Abstract ideas. For example, let's say you imagine or believe God to be a coercive being or a judgmental being is an abstract idea. Think of it like a little cloud floating up in the sky above you. That's your abstract conceptualization of God. Abstract ideas never stay in the realm of the abstract. They always trickle down to tangible reality.
Mm.
There's a reason why in the Dark Ages, the soldiers who fought on behalf of the church, on behalf of Christendom, would rape and pillage and murder. It's not because you had an entire civilization of psychopaths and sociopaths. Psychopaths and sociopaths are a very rare phenomenon in the world. What you had was an entire civilization living out the picture of God that they had. They believed that God was coercive. They believed he was cruel. They believed he was tyrannical. And they
Mm.
believed that people who weren't like them were not as human as they were. They were vermin. They could be exterminated. Same thing you can say with Nazi Germany and many other of these mass social events where you see large groups of people doing absolutely horrendous things. It's abstract ideals manifesting themselves in tangible reality. And I think that there's a reason why as well, and this is going back to my Latino context, there's a reason why so many young Adventist Latino kids are so stressed out in church all the time. You know, you have parents who believe that God is judgmental, that God is exacting and cruel, and that
Yeah.
trickles down to their parenting style. You know,
Mm.
they relate to their kids in the same controlling way that they believe God relates to them. So your abstract affects your tangible. And this is why it's so important to heal the abstract, because when the abstract is healed, the tangible follows. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right? And it's like, look at Jesus tangible. Look at how he walked and how he lived and how he related to people. He was living out the true character of God. And if we can have that true character of God as our abstract, as our cosmology, it impacts how we relate to other people. And it's
Yeah.
even now, like I see, you know, people who profess to be Christian who who will just support all kinds of really oppressive and cruel things. Like I saw a news story about some country that had criminalized homosexuality. And what that meant was if a person came out as being LGBT, they could go to prison and even be killed, right? And all these Christians were like, yes, this is the right thing to do. And I'm just like,
Mm.
wow. You know,
Mm.
when your picture of God is like that,
Mm.
though, it's not that
Yeah.
these Christians are all cruel, sadistic beings. It's that this complies with the abstract that they have. And that abstract always trickles down to tangible reality. It's the reason why parents of gay kids or lesbian kids or bi kids, you know, any of those LGBT experiences, it's the reason why they feel justified in kicking their kids out of the house and blocking off all financial support and access and affection, because they think that they're doing God a favor, because the God they worship is cruel, you know. And so long as your abstract is cruel, and most of the time, like I said, the abstract is actually a projection of your own insecurities and your own unprocessed traumas. It's not a true reflection of God. It's a projection, which is why deprojection is necessary. But so long as that's there, you're going to continue to live that out tangibly, man. So yeah, we need Jesus to heal our picture of God so that we can show up in society in ways that cultivate healing and restoration, as opposed to more cycles of pain.
Amen. Marcos, thank you so much. It has been
Absolutely,
a true
bro.
pleasure having this conversation with you, man. I think our both of our prayers are for Jesus to come soon.
Yes,
We
sir.
are ready to go home. But in the meantime, man, may the Lord continue to bless you there where you are. Say hi to your wife Candace for us, to your kiddos, and don't get eaten by a croc, by a big one. Don't get bit by a spider. But yeah, man, thank you so much. Appreciate the conversation here tonight.
Thanks, bro. Have a good one.
Thank you. Folks, there you have it. Thank you. God bless. I'll see you next time.